On a sunny Saturday afternoon, David Anderson thought he was simply running an errand, a quick stop for groceries in a crowded parking lot. But when he pulls into a coveted parking spot, a storm he never saw coming arrives in the form of Linda Carson, a stranger with a twisted sense of entitlement. What begins as an ordinary dispute over a parking space turns into something far darker, igniting a clash fueled by prejudice and privilege. With onlookers gathering and accusations flying, David faces an impossible choice: stay silent and let her control the narrative, or defend his dignity at the risk of becoming the villain in her story. Little does he know, this confrontation will test not only his patience but also his resolve, pulling him into a fight for justice that will leave everyone questioning where the real truth lies. Every moment drips with tension and uncertainty, reminding us that sometimes, even the simplest actions can spark a fire that exposes hidden prejudices, and that justice, once demanded, will echo louder than any accusation. It was a bright, sunlit Saturday afternoon, and David Anderson was looking forward to a quick, hassle-free stop at the grocery store. The week had been long, and he welcomed the brief escape of weekend errands. He cruised down the rows of parked cars, scanning for a free spot in the bustling lot. Then, there it was, a rare, open space near the entrance, a small victory. David eased his car into the spot, his movements unhurried, savoring the easy rhythm of the day. As he opened his door and stepped out, a sharp screech of tires ripped through the peaceful air, snapping him out of his relaxed state. A white SUV barreled up beside him, nearly scraping his car in its hurry. He looked up, surprised, and found himself staring into the furious eyes of the woman behind the wheel. Before she even rolled down her window, her glare was searing. She leaned out and jabbed a finger toward him, her expression twisted with fury. "That was my spot," she yelled, her voice sharp and indignant. David blinked, taken aback by the intensity of her anger. He hadn't seen any waiting cars when he pulled in, and the spot had appeared open. "Excuse me," he responded, keeping his tone calm. He wasn't here to start a confrontation. The woman, mid-40s, with piercing eyes and a face etched with irritation, slammed her car door shut and stormed toward him. She didn't lower her voice, even though her anger was beginning to attract attention. "I had my blinker on," she spat, closing the distance between them. "I was waiting for that spot, and you just took it like it was yours to take." David remained steady, though he could feel the stir of unease in his chest. He was familiar with encounters like this, with anger that seemed far too outsized for the situation. "Ma'am," he replied, forcing himself to stay composed, "I didn't see you waiting. The spot was empty, so I parked. I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding." But his calmness only seemed to agitate her further. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a sneer. "Of course, you didn't see me," she shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. "You people never do." David's jaw tightened as her words cut through him, but he held his ground. He had dealt with coded insults like this before, yet each time it stung just as deeply. He took a breath, willing himself not to react. "Look," he said evenly, "I'm not looking for any trouble. I just came here to get groceries. It's only a parking spot." But she ignored his attempt at de-escalation, her anger swelling as if his calmness was a personal affront. "Oh, I know exactly what you're here for," she sneered, her voice rising. "You people think you can just walk into our neighborhoods, take whatever you want, and act like you own the place." David's pulse quickened as he felt his patience start to fray. It was no longer just about a parking spot. He felt the weight of her words, the implications she hurled without restraint, as if his very presence was offensive. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice controlled, "I suggest we both just walk away before this goes any further." The woman took another step closer, invading his space, her finger pointed directly at his chest. "Walk away," she scoffed. "You don't get to tell me what to do. People like you think you're untouchable, that the rules don't apply to you." David could feel his fists clench at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his composure. A small crowd was beginning to form around them, people glancing over, some subtly recording on their phones, their expressions curious but hesitant. "Lady, it's a parking spot," David said, his voice edged with frustration. "There's no need to make this into something it doesn't have to be." She laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding cars. "Something it doesn't have to be? Do you know who I am?" But before David could respond, she lashed out. Her hand swung through the air, and her palm connected with his cheek in a loud, jarring slap that echoed through the parking lot. The sting burned, but it was the humiliation that hit him harder, more deeply than he could have imagined. The crowd gasped, shocked into silence. David stood frozen for a split second, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He could feel the anger welling up, the urge to retaliate. She had slapped him in broad daylight, in front of strangers, as if he had no right to defend himself. And then, without thinking, he raised his own hand. His slap was controlled, more restrained than hers, but firm enough to send a message. A line he had hoped not to cross, crossed in an instant. Linda staggered back, her eyes wide with shock, her hand flying to her cheek as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. The color drained from her face, and she let out a shrill scream. You hit me," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "You animal. I'll make sure you pay for this." The crowd murmured, some people shifting uncomfortably, others whispering among themselves. David looked around, seeing the familiar looks of suspicion and judgment settling on their faces. He could already feel the tide of perception turning against him, despite her provocation, despite the slap she'd given him first. David took a step back, his heart racing, knowing that this situation had just spiraled far beyond his control. David felt the weight of every gaze around him, the whispers slicing through the tension like knives. He hadn't wanted any of this, but now he stood in the middle of a scene that he knew could go wrong for him in 1,000 ways. Across from him, Linda recovered her composure, the shock on her face quickly transforming into a seething, calculated rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice low yet venomous. She looked around at the crowd, her voice climbing in volume. "Did you all see that? This man just attacked me." She clutched her cheek, her tone laced with a mix of horror and indignation. "He hit me. And for what? For trying to defend my own space." David's mouth opened, ready to explain himself, but he knew that whatever he said, Linda would twist it. He watched as her performance continued, her voice rising to draw as much sympathy from the crowd as she could. One by one, the bystanders' faces began to shift. There was judgment, confusion, even a few disgusted glances in David's direction. He had seen these reactions before, he knew how easily strangers could make up their minds based on appearance alone. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "you slapped me first. I only defended myself." But Linda scoffed loudly, letting out a dramatic gasp that was pure theater. "Defended yourself? Against a woman?" She spat the words, the crowd now fully engrossed in her retelling of events. She was clearly accustomed to people taking her side, and she played the victim perfectly, her eyes brimming with crocodile tears. "You don't get to just walk away from this," she screamed, stepping closer again, her finger inches from his face. "I'm not done with you." David looked around, noticing that a few people were recording with their phones. Every instinct told him to walk away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now would make him look even more suspicious. And Linda knew it too, he could see it in the sly, confident smirk that tugged at the corners of her mouth. She wanted to control the narrative, to make him out as the aggressor. David glanced around, locking eyes with a few onlookers. "You saw what happened," he said, hoping that someone might step forward. "You saw her slap me first." But no one spoke up. The crowd was gripped by a mix of morbid curiosity and fear of getting involved. Their silence was all the affirmation Linda needed. "That's right," she sneered, turning back to him. "No one is going to take your side. You think you can come here, act however you want, and just get away with it? Not today." David's fists tightened at his sides, his patience fraying. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to get my groceries," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is not worth all this drama." Linda's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in close, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for him. "Drama?" she repeated. "You're going to wish this was just drama by the time I'm done with you." For a moment, David considered just walking away, turning his back on the insults and the accusations. But he knew that would only confirm her version of events in the eyes of the crowd. Instead, he took a step back, putting more space between them. "Look," he said, loud enough for the bystanders to hear, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to buy groceries. I'm done with this." With that, he turned and began walking toward the store entrance, his heart pounding. He didn't want to let her push him around, but he also didn't want to be pulled any deeper into her web of accusations. This woman was a trap, and every instinct told him he had to escape before things got worse. But he barely took 3 steps before he felt a violent shove from behind, causing him to stumble forward, just catching himself before falling. He spun around, seeing Linda standing with her chest heaving, her eyes wild with fury. "You think you can walk away from me?" she yelled, her voice sharp and piercing. "I'm not finished with you yet." The crowd gasped, a few people murmuring in surprise, but no one moved to intervene. David held his hands up defensively, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Lady, you need to back off," he warned, struggling to keep his tone even. "You don't get to put your hands on me." Linda stepped closer, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "Oh, I'll do whatever I want," she sneered. "You people always think you can get away with anything. Well, not here. Not with me." David clenched his fists, the weight of her words pressing on him like a suffocating fog. He had encountered this kind of open prejudice before, but it was rare for someone to display it so boldly, so unapologetically. It was as if she believed she was untouchable, that she could say and do whatever she pleased without facing any consequences. "Walk away," he said quietly, his tone serious. "For your own sake." But Linda just laughed, an ugly sound that echoed off the surrounding cars. "Oh, is that a threat?" she mocked, her eyes gleaming with contempt. "Let me tell you something, boy, I'm not afraid of you." The word struck like a slap, sharp and degrading. David felt a surge of anger rise within him, a deep, painful resentment that clawed at his composure. He had been calm, patient, restrained. He had tried to walk away, to end the encounter before it got worse. But Linda wasn't interested in that. She wanted a scene. She wanted to feel superior, to belittle him in front of others as if it were her right. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and firm. "This isn't worth it," he said, half to her, half to himself. "You need to leave me alone." But Linda only smirked, taking a step back and folding her arms as she glared at him with an expression of pure satisfaction. She looked around, addressing the crowd. "You all saw that, right? I'm being harassed in my own neighborhood." David could feel his pulse pounding, the urge to shout his innocence almost overwhelming. He forced himself to stay composed, knowing that losing his temper would only play into her hands. But deep down, he knew that things weren't going to end here. Linda's anger was a storm that wouldn't be quelled easily. And as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, some judgmental, others indifferent, he felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. This was only the beginning. David finally turned his back on Linda, walking briskly toward the store. His cheek still stung from the slap, but more than that, he felt the weight of her hateful words burning in his mind. He took a few steadying breaths as he reached the store entrance, trying to shake off the humiliation and frustration that clung to him like a shadow. All he wanted was a few groceries. He hadn't asked for this confrontation, and he certainly didn't want it to escalate any further. But as he navigated the aisles, grabbing the essentials he needed, he found himself replaying the incident over and over. Each insult, each accusation echoed in his mind. The disbelief in the crowd's eyes as Linda shouted about being the victim replayed like a bitter reminder of the reality he faced. A part of him wanted to just brush it off and continue his day, but another part, the part that felt the sting of her slap, the shame of her sneer, knew it wasn't that simple. When he'd gathered the items on his list, David headed to the checkout. He tried to keep his composure, giving the cashier a polite nod as he paid and gathered his bags. But the tension in his chest was still there, stubbornly lingering. As he exited the store and walked toward his car, he hoped Linda had left. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation. But as David approached his car, his heart sank. He noticed it immediately, the long, jagged scratches that stretched across the side of his car. Deep, angry gouges in the paint that hadn't been there before. He stopped in his tracks, staring in disbelief. His mind reeled, struggling to process what he was seeing. It didn't take much imagination to guess who was responsible. The fresh damage seemed like an extension of Linda's rage, a reminder that she wasn't finished with him yet. This wasn't just vandalism, it was personal, a silent declaration of her contempt. David clenched his jaw, the anger he had held back during their confrontation simmering beneath the surface. He had tried to be calm, to walk away, to end things peacefully. But Linda had crossed a line. This wasn't just a parking lot dispute anymore, she had taken it further, deliberately damaging his property out of spite. For a moment, he considered letting it go, chalking it up as just another unfortunate encounter. But as he traced a finger over the deep scratches, he realized that walking away would mean letting her get away with it. He'd endured enough. It was time to stand up for himself. Pulling out his phone, he took several pictures of the damage. The evidence was clear, irrefutable. He needed to report this. He felt a mix of determination and trepidation as he dialed the non-emergency line, describing the situation to the operator. "Thank you, sir," the operator responded after taking his details. "Please hold for a moment." David waited, his heart pounding in his chest, eyes scanning the parking lot. And then, as if on cue, he saw Linda's white SUV pulling out from the other side of the lot. She hadn't left after all, she'd been watching him. Her face wore a smug smile as she drove slowly past, her gaze meeting his for a brief, mocking second. She knew exactly what she had done, and she was proud of it. Fueled by frustration and the sense of being wronged, David ended the call and decided to follow her at a distance. He kept a safe space between their cars, his focus trained on her SUV as it weaved through the quiet suburban streets. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing through the consequences of his decision to pursue her. The operator's voice returned on the line, directing him to maintain a safe distance and keep them updated on their location until an officer could intercept. As they continued, David's mind flashed through the possible outcomes. He knew how these situations often played out. it wouldn't be the first time a black man standing up for himself was painted as the aggressor. He had seen it happen to friends and family, heard the countless stories. But this time felt different. This time, he was determined not to let her accusations go unanswered. Several minutes later, he saw flashing lights in the rearview mirror. Relief washed over him as a police car approached, finally pulling over Linda's SUV at a red light. David slowed down, parking a short distance behind her, and watched as two officers exited their car, approaching her window. From where he sat, he couldn't hear the exchange, but he saw Linda gesturing wildly, pointing back toward him, her face a mixture of anger and indignation. She was already telling her version of the story, twisting the events to her advantage, painting herself as the victim. David took a deep breath, steadying himself as one of the officers turned toward him, motioning for him to step out of his car. He exited slowly, gathering his composure, and approached the officer. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his tone neutral, professional. David explained everything as calmly as he could, the initial confrontation, Linda's aggression, the slap, and finally the damage to his car. He showed the officer the photos he'd taken of the scratches and described how she'd driven away from the scene. Linda's voice broke through, shrill and indignant. "He hit me. He attacked me first, and now he's harassing me." David clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to argue back, knowing that anger would only worsen the situation. Instead, he addressed the officer directly, his voice steady. "She struck me first, officer," he said, looking them in the eye. "And she damaged my car while I was in the store. I have the pictures to prove it." The officers exchanged glances, one of them nodding slowly. "We'll need to take a look at both of your vehicles," he said, motioning for David to lead him over. David pointed out the scratches on his car, the fresh, jagged lines that marred the paint. The officer inspected the damage carefully, nodding as he examined the photos on David's phone for comparison. When he finished, he turned back to Linda's SUV, inspecting her vehicle as well. David stood back, watching as the officers continued their investigation. He could still hear Linda's voice, loud and frantic, as she tried to justify her actions, insisting that she had been the one assaulted. But this time, he felt a quiet confidence, a resolve that strengthened with every passing second. The officer returned to David after a few minutes, his expression calm but firm. "We're going to need statements from both of you," he said, handing David a card with instructions to follow up at the police station. David nodded, grateful for the glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was willing to see the truth of the situation. As he climbed back into his car, he glanced at Linda's furious expression through her window. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time that day, he felt the scales tipping in his favor. David left the grocery store parking lot that afternoon with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The encounter had left him shaken, but he knew he couldn't let this pass without standing up for himself. Linda's actions had crossed a line, and he was done with staying silent. As he drove toward the police station to give his statement, the weight of the situation settled heavily in his chest. He had to make sure the truth was heard. At the station, David met with Officer Reynolds, a calm, attentive officer who had been at the scene. Officer Reynolds led him into a small office where he sat across a desk, his gaze focused and sympathetic. "Thank you for coming in," Officer Reynolds said. "Could you start by giving a detailed account of everything that happened from the moment you arrived at the grocery store?" David took a steadying breath and began recounting the story. He described the parking lot, the initial verbal confrontation, Linda's shove, the slap, and his reaction. He explained how he had tried to walk away, only to find the scratches on his car when he returned. His voice was measured, calm, but the memory of each moment brought flashes of anger and humiliation. When he finished, Officer Reynolds nodded, jotting down notes. And you have photos of the damage to your vehicle, correct? He asked. Yes, I took several pictures right after I saw the scratches, David replied, scrolling through his phone and showing the images. Officer Reynolds studied them, his face unreadable, before he nodded and looked back up. Thank you, David, he said, his tone reassuring. We're documenting this, and we'll also reach out to the grocery store to check if they have any security footage from the parking lot. David felt a flicker of hope. Evidence would be critical. He nodded, a faint relief in his chest. Thank you, Officer Reynolds. I appreciate that. As he got up to leave, Officer Reynolds held out a card. Here's my direct line. If you remember anything else or if she tries to contact you, let me know. We're taking this seriously. David thanked him again, the weight in his chest easing just a little. The situation felt overwhelming, but he was determined to see it through. A few days later, David received a call from Officer Reynolds. They had obtained the security footage, which showed Linda's car pulling up aggressively beside David's and a subsequent altercation. The footage clearly captured her initiating the confrontation and later scratching his car while he was inside the store. That footage, combined with the photos you provided, strengthens your case significantly, Officer Reynolds explained over the phone. Given the evidence, we're moving forward with charges for property damage and assault. The words sent a wave of relief and validation through David. Finally, it felt as if the truth was beginning to surface. He thanked Officer Reynolds again, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. However, the sense of relief was soon interrupted. Just a few hours later, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but he answered anyway. David Anderson, came a familiar, venomous voice. His stomach sank. Linda, he replied, his voice guarded. Oh, so you remember my name now, she sneered. Let me be clear. You don't know who you're dealing with. Do you have any idea what I can do to you? David took a breath, his grip tightening on the phone. I don't have anything to say to you, Linda, he said, his voice steady. She laughed, a mocking, taunting sound. Oh, you think this is over because you went crying to the cops? Just wait. I'll make sure you regret this. You messed with the wrong person. Before David could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, a mix of frustration and anger simmering beneath the surface. He immediately dialed Officer Reynolds, relaying the conversation and emphasizing her threat. We'll add this to the report, Officer Reynolds assured him. If she continues to contact or threaten you, let us know immediately. I'd advise you not to respond to her directly. David hung up, exhaling deeply. The harassment wasn't just an isolated moment. Linda was determined to make his life difficult, to paint him as the villain. But he was equally determined to hold her accountable. A week later, David received notice of the upcoming court date. His mind filled with questions and apprehensions about the legal battle ahead. As he prepared for the trial, he met with his lawyer, Denise Cole, a confident, sharp-minded attorney with a reputation for her tenacity and empathy. She listened intently as David explained every detail of the incident, her focus unwavering. Based on the evidence we have, including the footage and witness accounts, you have a strong case, Denise reassured him. Linda Carson's behavior and the damage she inflicted on your property show a clear pattern of aggression. David felt a flicker of hope. Do you think the court will actually hold her accountable? He asked. Denise gave him a steady look. With the right approach, yes. But I'll be honest with you, David, people like her often rely on public perception and privilege to manipulate the narrative. We have to be prepared for her to portray herself as the victim. She'll likely bring in character witnesses, maybe even try to paint this as a misunderstanding or an emotional outburst. David clenched his jaw, the memory of her insults, her threats, burning in his mind. She's not a victim. She's just used to getting away with this. Denise nodded. I know. And that's why we're going to fight this. We'll gather statements from bystanders and use the security footage to reinforce the truth. We'll present everything in a way that leaves no room for doubt. In the days leading up to the trial, David's anxiety grew, but so did his resolve. He knew this case was about more than just a parking lot dispute. It was about standing up to someone who had made it her mission to humiliate him, to abuse her power and privilege. He didn't want to fight, but Linda had left him no choice. Each time he drove past the grocery store, memories of that day flooded back, a bitter reminder of how quickly prejudice could twist into something ugly and dangerous. But he steeled himself, focusing on the support of friends, family, and his lawyer, who reminded him why he was doing this, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been in his position, forced to defend their dignity in the face of injustice. And as the court date loomed closer, David felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever Linda threw at him, he was ready. This was his stand, not just for justice, but for the principle that people like her didn't get to dictate the truth. Not this time. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation on the day of the trial. David sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture steady but his heart racing beneath the surface. He glanced around, taking in the faces of the jury, the judge seated high above them, and Linda Carson at the defense table, her demeanor cold and defiant. Her lawyer, a tall man with graying hair named Gerald Spencer, exuded an air of confidence, as if this was just another routine case to win. David's lawyer, Denise Cole, leaned over to him, her voice calm and steady. Remember, this is about presenting the facts clearly. Let the evidence speak for itself. We've got this. He nodded, taking a deep breath to ground himself as the judge called the courtroom to order. He'd come here to seek justice, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing worry that things might turn against him. He had seen too many cases where the truth was twisted and appearances mattered more than actions. The trial began with opening statements. Denise stood up, her voice strong and measured as she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about accountability. On that day in the parking lot, Ms. Carson did not simply have a disagreement over a parking space, she chose to harass, assault, and vandalize my client's property. Today, you will hear evidence that paints a clear picture of her intent to harm and humiliate Mr. Anderson, actions that should not and cannot go without consequence. Gerald rose to his feet, adjusting his tie as he stepped forward with a soft, almost pitying expression. We ask you to remember that Ms. Carson is a respected member of the community, a mother and business owner who experienced a momentary lapse in judgment. She reacted out of frustration, a very human mistake, but by no means a criminal act. We urge you to see the context of this incident, to consider that she is no threat but simply a person who had a bad day. David's hands clenched beneath the table. He could feel the subtle framing Gerald was using, painting Linda as a sympathetic figure, downplaying the harm she had caused. The familiar knot of frustration tightened in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was all part of their strategy. As the trial continued, Denise presented the evidence piece by piece. Security footage from the grocery store played on a screen for the jury to see. It clearly showed Linda's SUV aggressively pulling up beside David's car, the verbal exchange, and the moment when Linda struck him. The camera had captured her scratching his car as well, confirming his account in undeniable detail. Denise turned to the jury after the footage concluded. This is not a momentary lapse or an act of frustration. This is premeditated, deliberate behavior meant to intimidate and humiliate Mr. Anderson. She escalated the situation beyond any reasonable level, then tried to flee, confident that she would face no consequences. But we are here to show that her actions do have consequences. When it was Linda's turn to testify, she walked to the stand, her posture dignified and reserved, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her lawyer approached with a warm smile, framing her in the light of someone misunderstood. "Ms. Carson," he began, his voice gentle, "can you tell us what was going through your mind that day?" Linda let out a dramatic sigh, her voice trembling as she spoke. Honestly, I was afraid. I had waited for that parking spot, and when he took it, I felt disrespected. I know now that I could have handled things differently, but I was so overwhelmed. I felt threatened. Gerald nodded sympathetically. "You mean you felt threatened by Mr. Anderson?" "Yes," she replied, her voice small. "I only reacted the way I did because I felt unsafe. I never meant to harm anyone, but he was so aggressive. And when he slapped me," she paused, dabbing at imaginary tears. "I was just trying to defend myself." Denise rose for cross-examination, her expression sharp. "Ms. Carson, you stated you felt threatened. Can you explain why?" Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Well, he was just so intense. He looked at me in a way that made me feel unsafe." Denise took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "In the footage, we see you approach him aggressively, shout insults, and initiate physical contact. Does that look like self-defense?" Linda's face reddened slightly, her composure faltering. Maybe I overreacted, but anyone would feel threatened in my position." "Anyone?" Denise pressed, her voice calm but firm. "Or someone who feels entitled to control a situation simply because they think they can." Linda's face hardened, but she stayed silent, her jaw clenched as she held Denise's gaze. Denise returned to her seat, and next, David took the stand. As he walked to the witness box, he felt the weight of 100 silent judgments on him, but he focused on his resolve to tell the truth. Denise began her questioning. "David, could you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" David took a deep breath and began. He described how he'd parked, how Linda had immediately escalated the situation, how he had tried to remain calm and walk away. He recounted the slap and the humiliation he felt when he saw the damage to his car. His voice was steady, filled with the quiet strength he had summoned to endure each moment of that ordeal. "Thank you, David," Denise said, offering him a nod of encouragement before she returned to her seat. Linda's lawyer stood up, a subtle smirk on his face as he approached. "Mr. Anderson, you say you only defended yourself. But couldn't it be said that you, too, reacted in anger?" David met his gaze. "I didn't hit her out of anger. I responded after she slapped me, yes, but it was controlled. I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted her to stop." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "So, you admit that you struck her?" "Yes," David replied firmly. "After she slapped me first, I defended myself." Gerald pressed on, clearly aiming to cast doubt. "And isn't it true that you followed Ms. Carson in your vehicle after the incident?" David's hands gripped the edge of the witness box. "I followed her because she had damaged my property. I called the police and kept my distance, just as they instructed." The lawyer nodded, feigning sympathy. "So, you're saying you acted out of a sense of justice?" "Yes," David said. "I wanted her to face the consequences of her actions, just like anyone else would." When David stepped down, he returned to his seat beside Denise, his heart pounding. The defense had tried to turn his words against him, to paint him as the aggressor. But he felt a glimmer of hope as he looked at the jury, some of whom seemed swayed by his sincerity. After both sides presented their closing statements, the jury filed out to deliberate. The silence in the courtroom was thick, each minute stretching like an hour. David's heart pounded, but he held on to the hope that the truth would prevail. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood and cleared her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Linda Carson, guilty of assault and property damage." The words echoed in David's ears, each syllable a balm to the wounds he had carried since that day. Relief flooded through him as he glanced at Denise, who gave him a nod of affirmation. Linda sat at her table, stunned, her face drained of color. For once, the certainty and entitlement she had carried were gone, replaced by disbelief and anger. She stood, muttering threats under her breath, but no one paid her any attention. As the judge issued the sentence, community service, a fine for property damage, and a restraining order against David, he felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. Justice, even if imperfect, had finally been served. And as David left the courthouse that day, he felt a newfound resolve. He'd stood up, told the truth, and won. It was a small victory, but a significant one, a step toward reclaiming his dignity and setting an example for anyone who had ever been in his shoes. As David stepped out of the courthouse, the cool breeze washed over him, bringing with it a sense of relief that felt almost surreal. The trial had ended with the verdict he had hoped for, but he was left feeling a strange mixture of triumph and exhaustion. Justice had been served, yet he couldn't shake the bitterness of the experience. He had been forced to defend his dignity in a way he'd never wanted. He had relived each insult, each moment of humiliation, all for the sake of holding Linda accountable. Denise joined him on the courthouse steps, a supportive hand on his shoulder. "You did well in there, David," she said, her voice warm and encouraging. "You stood your ground and didn't let her narrative control the story." David nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Thank you, Denise. For everything." He paused, his mind still swirling with the memories of the trial. "I know we won, but I don't know if I feel like I've won anything." Denise looked at him with understanding. "That's the weight of fighting these battles, David. You proved the truth, and you held someone accountable who thought she could get away with anything. But it doesn't erase the harm, I know. And that's something only time can help with." As she walked away, David stood for a while, watching people come and go. Linda's entitlement, her manipulation, the judgment from onlookers, they'd all left an impression on him that wouldn't soon fade. But despite the lingering heaviness, he knew that he had done the right thing by standing up for himself. The weeks that followed were a mix of relief and quiet reflection. David returned to his normal routines, going to work, spending time with friends and family, but he noticed that something had shifted within him. Linda's actions, and the way so many had quickly accepted her accusations, had cast a harsh light on the world he lived in. It was a reminder that prejudice could lurk in everyday encounters, turning even the smallest misunderstanding into a weapon. One evening, he met up with a few friends at a cafe, hoping to unwind. As they settled around a table, his best friend Marcus noticed the pensive look on his face. "You've been different since the trial, man," Marcus said, his tone gentle. "It's like something's weighing on you." David took a deep breath, realizing he hadn't fully expressed his feelings about the whole ordeal. "It's just, what happened with Linda reminded me of how easily someone's perception of you can turn into a weapon against you. She made me feel like I didn't even belong in my own neighborhood. And even with all the evidence, I had to work so hard just to get people to believe me." His friends listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of empathy and understanding. "It's exhausting," David continued, "constantly having to prove yourself, even when you're in the right. And it made me realize that people like Linda feel untouchable because so often, they are." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "But you made a difference, David. You didn't let her get away with it. That's something. And who knows, maybe she'll think twice next time." David nodded, a faint smile breaking through his somber expression. "Maybe. I just hate that it had to happen at all." One afternoon, David received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Linda's attorney, though it wasn't another legal notice. Instead, it contained a brief, formal apology from Linda herself, likely written under her lawyer's guidance. "Mr. Anderson, I want to acknowledge that my actions during our encounter were wrong and caused you harm. I understand the consequences of my behavior and regret the distress I caused you." There was no warmth, no sincerity, only the bare minimum of an apology crafted to fulfill a legal obligation. David shook his head, the apology feeling hollow, a formality rather than genuine remorse. But he placed the letter aside, a symbol of closure he didn't necessarily need, but accepted. As the months passed, David found himself thinking about the lessons he had learned from the experience. One evening, as he sat alone, he decided to write down his thoughts, capturing the moments of frustration, fear, and resilience that had defined the ordeal. It was a way to process everything, to put words to the emotions that had lingered even after the verdict. He wrote about the exhaustion of having to constantly prove himself, about the unfairness of navigating a world where a single accusation could lead to judgment without question. But he also wrote about the importance of standing up, of not letting people like Linda silence him or define his truth. One night, he shared the story online, posting it in hopes that others might find solace, validation, or even courage in his experience. He didn't expect much attention, but to his surprise, the post quickly gained traction. Messages poured in from people who had faced similar injustices, people who thanked him for sharing and reminded him that he was not alone in this struggle. Each message reminded him that his story had an impact, that his decision to fight back resonated far beyond the courtroom. He hadn't just fought for himself, he had fought for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of prejudice. In time, the bitterness began to ease. He took comfort in knowing that he had done what he could to confront Linda's entitlement and hold her accountable. While he couldn't erase what had happened, he could move forward with a renewed sense of purpose and resilience. One afternoon, as David walked through his neighborhood, he spotted a young man struggling to parallel park near a crowded area. David chuckled, remembering how he, too, had once struggled with parking in tight spots. He approached the driver and offered some advice, helping guide him into the spot. As he walked away, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. It was a small moment, a quiet reminder of how far he'd come. He couldn't change the prejudice that lingered in the world, but he could choose to meet it with dignity, strength, and an unwavering sense of self. And as he moved forward, David knew that he would continue to stand up for himself and others, because every stand, no matter how small, was a step toward a world where people like Linda couldn't so easily weaponize their entitlement and prejudice. The echoes of that painful day would stay with him, but they had also given him something valuable, a deeper understanding of himself, his strength, and the quiet resilience that had carried him through. In the end, justice had been served not just in the courtroom, but within himself, as he found peace in the power of his own story. Months after the trial, David found that his life had settled into a new normal. Yet, the experience had left him with a heightened awareness of the power of stories, and the importance of standing up against prejudice. He'd received messages from people across the country who had read his online post, sharing their own stories of resilience, frustration, and hope. The support reminded him that he wasn't alone, and more than that, it stirred in him a sense of responsibility. David began volunteering with a local organization that advocated for victims of racial discrimination. He started attending their meetings, speaking with people who, like him, had faced injustice in various forms. He listened to their stories, each one echoing with similar themes of resilience, frustration, and the determination to find justice. One evening, after a group meeting, he spoke with the organization's founder, an older man named Carl. Carl had been through his own share of battles over the years, and he looked at David with a knowing smile. "Standing up isn't easy, is it?" Carl said, his voice calm but filled with hard-earned wisdom. "It can make you feel tired, angry, even hopeless at times. But it's worth it. Every story, every person who refuses to stay silent, helps push back against a system that often refuses to listen." David nodded, reflecting on Carl's words. "I just want to make sure what I went through has a purpose. That it's not just another story that people forget." Carl placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Trust me. People don't forget. Every time we stand up, we remind others that they can do the same. It ripples out, even if we can't see it." That night, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wanted to use his experience, his story, to help others feel empowered to speak up. His story wasn't just his own anymore, it was part of a broader struggle, a collective push for justice and dignity. Inspired by this, David began speaking at local events, sharing his journey in the lessons he'd learned. He attended town hall meetings, college campuses, and community centers, sometimes to speak on his own, other times joining panels discussing systemic issues. Each speech became a way for him to not only share his story but also to encourage others to come forward with their own. One evening, at a university event, David told the story of his confrontation with Linda to a room full of students. He described the exhaustion of having to defend himself against baseless accusations, the anger that came with being seen as guilty before proven innocent. But he also spoke of the importance of standing up, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against him. As he finished, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "How do you keep going?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with genuine curiosity. "How do you keep standing up when it feels like things don't change?" David paused, considering her question carefully. "For me, it's about making sure my voice, my truth, doesn't get buried," he said. "I keep going because every time someone stands up, it chips away at the silence that lets these things happen. Change is slow, but every step forward makes a difference, no matter how small it feels." The students listened intently, and David could see that his words had struck a chord. He knew that the journey toward justice was long and filled with obstacles, but seeing their reactions gave him hope. As time went on, David's story began to attract more attention. Journalists reached out, asking him to share his experience on a larger platform. Reluctantly at first, he agreed to an interview with a respected online publication. He spoke openly, not only about the incident with Linda but about the broader realities of prejudice, of feeling out of place in spaces that should be safe and familiar. The interview went viral, sparking a wave of responses and discussions on social media. People shared their own stories in the comments, describing encounters with bias and injustice, but they also expressed gratitude for David's courage and honesty. David was moved by the impact his story had made. He had wanted to make a difference, and now he saw that his voice was helping others feel seen and validated. He realized that, in a way, Linda had given him a new purpose, though not in the way she had intended. Months later, David attended an event for the organization where he volunteered. As he mingled with people, listening to their stories, a woman approached him hesitantly. She looked nervous, her hands twisting together as she spoke. "Mr. Anderson, I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. "I read your interview, and it reminded me that I'm not alone. I've been through something similar, but I was always too afraid to speak up." David felt a swell of empathy as he listened to her story, seeing in her the same vulnerability he had felt on that day in the parking lot. "You're not alone," he said gently. "And your voice matters. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The woman nodded, a small smile breaking through her nervousness. They continued talking, sharing stories of resilience and encouragement. In that moment, David understood fully that his journey, his choice to speak up, had indeed made a difference. Later that night, David sat alone at home, reflecting on how far he had come since that painful day with Linda. He felt a quiet sense of pride, knowing that he had taken something ugly and used it to create something meaningful. The pain and humiliation had transformed into a purpose that gave him strength and clarity. He thought back to his conversation with Carl about the ripple effect. Each time he shared his story, he felt the ripples spreading further, reaching people who needed to know they weren't alone. He had found peace in knowing that his voice mattered, that he could use his experiences to uplift others. Linda's hate-filled accusations might have been intended to tear him down, but in the end, they had only fueled his resolve. He had stood up, and he would keep standing up, for himself, for others, and for a future where stories like his would no longer be the norm. David knew the road ahead was still long, but he faced it with a new confidence. He had found his purpose, and with it, a reason to keep pushing forward, one step at a time. As David's journey continued, he found that each encounter, each story he listened to, strengthened his commitment to creating a world where no one had to endure what he had. He became deeply involved with the organization, joining workshops, leading support groups, and even helping to draft initiatives aimed at holding accountable those who abused their privilege and power. His life had taken on new meaning, and he felt fulfilled in ways he never had before. One evening, he received a surprising email, an invitation to speak at a major social justice conference. Organizers had read his story and were moved by his resilience, inviting him to share his experience on a national stage. David felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. This would be the largest audience he'd ever addressed, and he knew the weight of his words could impact countless lives. As the conference day arrived, David stood backstage, watching people file into the auditorium. The lights dimmed, and the host introduced him, recounting his journey with genuine respect. When he stepped onto the stage, the applause filled the room, and for a moment, he simply took it in, letting himself feel the validation that he had once thought he'd never receive. He began his speech, his voice clear and steady. "My story began with a simple parking lot encounter, but it quickly escalated into something much bigger, a test of my dignity, my truth, and my resilience. What happened that day wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system that allows prejudice and entitlement to flourish unchecked. And like so many others, I was expected to stay silent, to bear the injustice quietly." He paused, looking out over the audience, his gaze sweeping over faces that mirrored empathy, anger, and encouragement. "But I chose to stand up, and that decision changed my life. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't comfortable. But every time we speak up, we challenge a narrative that has too often silenced us. Every time we refuse to let our stories be buried, we create space for change." He went on to talk about resilience, about finding strength in the face of adversity. He shared how he had turned his experience into a tool for advocacy, and how each person's story held the potential to ripple outward, inspiring others to stand up, too. "When we face these challenges," he continued, "we can choose to let them break us, or we can choose to turn them into something greater. For me, this journey has been about transforming pain into purpose. And I believe each one of us has the power to do the same." The room fell silent as he finished, and then the applause surged, a standing ovation that lasted longer than he'd expected. David felt a swell of pride and humility, knowing that his words had reached people in a meaningful way. After the conference, David was approached by a journalist who had attended his talk. She was working on a series focused on resilience and asked if she could write a feature on him. David agreed, seeing it as another opportunity to keep his story alive and, hopefully, inspire others. In the days that followed, the article circulated widely, sparking conversations about resilience, justice, and the strength needed to confront prejudice. David's story had struck a chord, and soon he began hearing from others who felt inspired by his journey. Messages from people who had faced their own injustices, who were finding their voices, flowed in, a reminder that standing up was not just a personal victory, but part of a larger movement. One afternoon, David received an unexpected call from Carl, the founder of the organization where he volunteered. "We're starting a new initiative," Carl said, his voice filled with excitement. "We want to build a mentorship program for young people who have faced discrimination, a place where they can share their stories and find support. I was wondering if you'd be interested in leading it with me." David didn't hesitate. "I'd love to," he replied, a sense of purpose lighting up within him. The mentorship program became a safe haven for young people, a place where they could find their voices without fear. David poured his heart into the project, meeting regularly with students and young adults, encouraging them to share their experiences, to find resilience in the face of adversity. Watching them transform from hesitant to empowered individuals brought him a deep sense of fulfillment. One evening, after a group session, a young man named Chris approached him. Chris had been quiet during meetings, often listening without saying much. But tonight, he looked at David with newfound determination. "Mr. Anderson," he began, "I just wanted to thank you. Hearing your story, it gave me the courage to stand up for myself. I reported something that happened to me at school, and even though it was hard, I didn't let them silence me." David felt a surge of pride. "That's incredible, Chris. Remember, your voice matters. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like it doesn't." Chris smiled, his shoulders straightening as he walked away, and David knew that the ripples of his own story were spreading further than he'd ever anticipated. As the years passed, David's work became a beacon of hope in the community. He continued to speak, to mentor, and to advocate for justice. Each time he helped someone else find their strength, he felt his own burdens lighten. The pain of that parking lot incident faded, replaced by a sense of peace and purpose. One day, as he walked through the neighborhood, he noticed how familiar it felt. The streets that had once felt hostile now seemed welcoming, filled with memories of triumph over hardship. He had come full circle, transforming an experience of pain and prejudice into a legacy of resilience and empowerment. David had chosen to rise above the anger, to channel his energy into something that could outlast the fleeting sting of a slap or the judgmental eyes of strangers. He had learned that resilience was not just about surviving, but about thriving in the face of adversity, and in that discovery, he had found true freedom. Linda's actions had ignited something in him that day, a spark that had grown into a fire. And that fire would continue to burn, not as a reminder of her hatred, but as a testament to his strength. In the end, David knew he had won far more than a courtroom battle. He had won his own peace, his own voice, and his own purpose. And as he looked toward the future, he was ready to keep pushing forward, one step at a time, leaving behind a legacy of resilience for those who would follow.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.